Good morning and welcome to BeefLink TV, your daily dose of industry information. This morning we welcome back Robert Windsor to talk about the UK and EU trade reset following a recent article in BeefLink magazine. Firstly, thank you for joining us this morning, Robert.
That's fine, it's a pleasure.
Very important topic.
Yes.
Why are we re-examining the relationship between the UK and the EU?
It's quite simple, actually. In the original trade deal between the EU and UK, it was written in that this working arrangement, free trade agreement, call it what you want, would be periodically reviewed. And it was every 5 years. And of course, the first year post us leaving that it should be reviewed is 2026, although of course we believe that most of the work is actually going to be done this year, and whatever comes out of it will be published, and it will influence the relationship for the future relationship between the EU and UK for the following 5 years. I mean, it's not uncommon. EUs have periodic reviews of all main agreements and that sort of stuff. So it's just one of those things. I mean, I don't actually like the word reset, I have to be honest. That's a personal view, not beef review, I emphasise, because I think it's raising certain aspirations and hopes, and whether or not those can be met are debatable at the moment, and at the moment we don't have a lot of clarity about what is actually on the agenda to be discussed. Now, one of the issues that we've got is that, if you like, the red lines that came about and caused such difficulty during the original Brexit negotiations are probably to some extent still there. And of course, the political situation has changed both in the UK and Europe, which is going to have an influence. And then in the other side of the fence, you've got the EU, who has to protect those four freedoms. And it's the freedom of movement of people, capital, goods and services. And if you are going to have a closer relationship with the European Union, and for instance, if you wanted sort of like, shall we say, an EFTA, European Free Trade Association agreement, you would have to actually agree to all of those as well, and you just can't pick and choose.
Sure.
Okay.
So what have been the main impacts of the UK leaving the EU?
Okay. It's the old phrase, isn't it? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. The official statistics indicate there has been a sharp drop in both import and export traffic. The figures, the official figures, these are of exports, show that they declined in between 2021 and 2023 by 27%, and for the same period, imports fell by 32%.
I see.
But it still has to be remembered that the EU is our biggest trading partner as a whole, and I think if you looked at the figures, Germany as a nation is the third biggest trading partner we've got in the world. And our trade with Europe was still, in 2023, they're the last available figures, was £800 billion, and that's a very substantial sum of money. Some members have said that they've noticed, trucks, maybe this the procedures haven't been followed properly and they never report, and the GMR hasn't been done properly, and so these things don't get reported. And I have seen figures which say that trade has only declined by 7%. We have to actually go by the official figures.
Sure.
Many people will probably take a view that it's somewhere between the two.
Sure. So what are the areas for cooperation?
Well, of course, the biggest change in the UK since the Brexit deal actually came into effect is, of course, we've had a change in administration. We now have a Labour government, and they have talked up improving the relationship with the EU, which under the previous administration was not as good as it could have and should have been. And that's hardly surprising given what happened with the Brexit thing.
Yeah.
The other thing we have to consider is that we are still implementing certain parts of the UK leaving Brexit. There is a document, it was called the Border Target Operating Model, and it was issued about 3 or 4 years ago, and we're only just putting the last bits into place.
Right.
And that we are seeing as the implementation of the safety and security declarations for goods coming into the country, into the UK, from the EU, as of the 31st of January. Now, the big change on that is that this impacts on road freight. And we've got to evaluate how it's going to work. We are seeing, certain controls regarding SPS goods, the foodstuffs, perishables, products of animal origin, they're still being considered, and how effective they are or how not. And so, in a way, you've got this situation where you've got the fairly late introduction of certain systems and the need for this review. So the question is, how much of an appetite is there to review? Talking to government departments, I get the impression, and certainly colleagues who have spoken to them, that it might not be so much in the trade area that we are going to be looking at, although there will be some elements of trade to be considered.
Sure.
One of the things that's hardly ever out of the news and was a major part of the Brexit campaign was the question of illegal immigration and clandestines, either coming in a truck, hidden away, or much more openly in a small boat. So, is there a chance of better cooperation, both on an operation and legal front? To give you just one very simple answer, we hear frequently from members they've found a clandestine or clandestines in their truck. It is great difficulty that they have in actually getting one of the law enforcement agencies to actually say, yes, we'll come and do something about it. And you get passed from pillar from post because it's not my problem. Okay, so that's one thing. I think one of the things that there will probably be quite a scope for looking at would be energy security. Obviously the world is changing, and obviously the question of environmental policies, can they be aligned? Because, not being funny, we have common seas, so there is possibility of some sort of arrangement on wind farms or sending power from a wind farm which is in the UK sector to Europe or something like that. And so that does bring in the whole question of climate cooperation. And I will say, from the work we do in the Sustainability Policy Group, there has been quite a lot continuing of alignment between the two. The European and the EU, the European and the UK regulations are not fundamentally dissimilar. There may be tweaks and there may be small variations, but in general terms, they are heading in the same direction. The other thing, of course, is due to the Ukrainian war with Russia, and also certain comments made the other side of the Atlantic about defence cooperation and how can that be improved. And, going back to the first point, it's can you align migration and immigration policies? And the world has changed in the last 5 years.
Absolutely.
And we've got to consider that.
Sure. So my next question is, where might there be some trade-related easements taking place?
That's an interesting one. Let's go back to absolute basics on this. When the UK was a member of the EU, we were a member of the customs union and the single market. It was only by being a member of both that we had the free trade situation we have. The British people did make a political decision that we wished to leave the EU. Therefore, we have to actually work out, is there anything we can do to bring that situation back? And the answer is no, in the short. But we can probably make trade work a little bit more easier. But I think we have to understand that the basic things of a customs entry will be required, probably a safety and security declaration will be required. You'll need an IPAS declaration. But where we actually feel that there could be some improvements would be the better joining up of, well, there's two things. Could you simplify some of the documentation?
Mm-hmm.
And could you actually simplify some of the data flows? And we'll give you a very simple example of the data flows. When you have to export goods from Europe to the UK or the UK to Europe, we use a system called IPAS for making the foodstuffs declarations. They use a system called Traces. If it's in Northern Ireland, it's called Traces NT. And what we actually have posed the question is, would it be possible for the data, shall we say, I'm coming from Europe, so I make my export declaration that these products are leaving the EU. I make my declaration in Europe to say it's coming, which gets the permission to leave, along with obviously customs rules and that sort of thing. And could that data be actually transferred into the IPAS declaration? So it's that sort of thing we're doing. Security is obviously a big issue, and we would only think that there's room for maybe simplifying some of the data sets and how it could be done. The other thing is, once again, could you have a centralised system? Of course, the problem with all this is cost. It will cost both the UK and EU money, and we know money is tight. We also are aware, of course, that, for instance, in the foodstuffs, there's been the outbreak of foot and mouth in Germany, which has caught the headlines. Not so much has been the outbreak of some nasty disease affecting sheep in Hungary. These things do count against making the rules easier because, biosecurity is important. It's essential, actually. People would point to this and say, we don't actually want easier trade in that sense because it will actually weaken our biosecurity.
Sure.
There's other things we've been looking at. It seems quite popular to allow freer travel of younger people under 30, and the Germans have been promoting that, and the Labour government has intimated it would not be opposed to this idea. The other thing would be, and we had touched on this, and it's one of these awkward things which nobody ever seems to get to grips with. Do you remember we did some of this about the EES, the entry and exit security system? We did, yeah. Which seems to be causing the European Union great problems. They're still not ready for it. Could there be some relaxation on that sort of thing? And in particular, the one thing we have touched upon before is drivers, both HGV drivers, and it's not our area, but I know the RHA have concerns for bus drivers, relaxing this 90 in 180-day rules. That, if you do 90 days, that's it, you can't go back until the 180 rolling period is exhausted, in effect. For certain things like HGV drivers, possibly, one of our members does concerts, rock concerts, classical concerts. You need to have people out there sometimes for several weeks. So, if there's a good business reason, that sort of thing. Yeah. The other thing is, and probably not many people deal with this, it's something called cabotage. And this is the ability of UK truckers, for instance. It's quite simple, the law in a way, but if you're from UK to Leipzig, for instance, and then come back, fine. But if you do UK Leipzig and then Leipzig Berlin Hanover or something like that, you can only do certain number of those before you have to return. And the rules, I'm led to believe, are stricter in the EU than in the UK. So could you actually make it easier for UK truckers to actually do business on that? I would have certain advantages. It's a bit more environmentally friendly because you're out there already. Obviously, UK hauliers would perhaps like it, but EU hauliers might say, well, that's more competition, so do we really want it? So, that's where we're at on things. So, if anybody does have an idea of what they want, but I would ask people just to remember it's got to be politically acceptable both to us and the EU.
Sure. We talked earlier about headlines being made around foot and mouth, but reference has also been made in the press to the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I felt people got their hopes up about this a bit too much. Pavel and I, who's been on many of these as well, this is another free trade agreement. It's quite a wide one. It was actually set up in 2012, and it's basically the EU member states, so that's 27, the EFTA countries, which is the European Free Trade countries, so that would be Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Faroe Islands and other places like that. Many of the Mediterranean countries, both in Europe and in North Africa, and places like Moldova, Georgia and Ukraine. It is only a free trade agreement, and I have to emphasize that. And what we see is that it would actually mean it would be probably easier for buyers, sellers, makers, buyers to ensure that the goods met rules of origin, and in particular what's called accumulation, where you can get goods from all of those countries into a product and send it. So in effect, it widens the place of supply to go into the product.
Yeah.
But once again, basic customs entries would still be required. You'd need proof of origin. You'd need to be able to verify that the criteria was being met to claim preference.
Sure.
Like most of these things, if it makes trade easier, fine. But it's not maybe the wildly encouraging silver bullet that some people have made out in the press.
And finally, do you have any further thoughts on this topic?
How long have you got? The first thing is we've got to hear it. We've got to put a realistic set of aspirations together, and that's where members can be helpful. As I say, we haven't had particular clarity on what is going to be on the agenda. The feedback is, in a way, this is our first renegotiation of this, and it's about developing a spirit of goodwill moving forward. So that's the important thing. We've got political considerations in the UK, and I'm not going into the state of the polls because that's not something that we do. I would like to conclude with a comment from Nick Thomas-Symonds, and he's the Minister for European Reform, and it was made on the 4th of February of this year. And when he referred to the reset, this is exactly what he said, and this is actually published on gov.uk. What does this mean? ? For this government, our relationship with the European Union does not mean hitting rewind. We are not undoing Brexit. So I think that rather sets the tone, and I think it actually sets the tone that it might not be quite such a broad re-evaluation of the relationship as maybe some people had hoped.
Sure, but there's lots to think about, definitely.
There is a lot. If we're honest, what we think is going to happen, and I've talked to my colleagues in policy and compliance about this before coming up here, the changes will be around the edge. Okay, the core will remain like customs entries, IPAS declarations, safety and security declarations. And in effect, what we've got to do is rebuild goodwill, and that's from both sides, actually. And, to start to see how this can be put together. One thing I understand that this reset is not looking at is the whole situation with Northern Ireland.
I see.
That's governed by separate agreement and legislation. So it is going to be I see this as the first stage of a part of a process, or some changes around the edge to maybe make things a bit easier. We've touched upon them. These are relatively minor things leading on to what's the next stage.
Sure.
And that will be 5 years from 2026. So you can be asking me that maybe in 2031.
Maybe. Thank you very much for your time this morning. I'm sure as things develop, we'll be continuing to update our members on this.
Yes, we will. And it's important that they do contribute, because in policy we don't get involved in the day-to-day nitty-gritty of how you do a customs entry or that sort of thing. And sometimes it's that sort of problem which actually should be known a bit more, because if there's a problem doing it easily and getting all the communications between different parties together, that actually is something we need to bring up.
Definitely, yeah. Thanks again, Robert.
Okay, thank you.
This topic has also been reported on in the February edition of Beef Links. We'll pop a link in the description below so you can read more on that. That's all for today's episode of Beef Link TV, your daily dose of industry information.